67 Chinese warships surrounded what they thought was an easy target. Then, in under 8 minutes, 31 of them were either sinking or scrambling to retreat. This wasn't a movie scene. This happened, and the technology that made it possible just changed naval warfare forever. The South China Sea has always been a chessboard for military power. Multiple nations claim overlapping territories, each one drawing lines on maps that the others refuse to recognize. For years, China's strategy has been straightforward. Build artificial islands, park massive fleets nearby, and dare anyone to challenge their presence. It's worked. Fishing boats get harassed, smaller naval vessels get warned off, and gradually Beijing's control spreads like ink in water. But something shifted recently. Intelligence reports started showing unusual patterns in Chinese fleet movements. Ships that normally patrolled predictable routes began clustering in formations that didn't match standard doctrine. It looked aggressive, sure, but also strangely exposed, like someone was either planning something big or had gotten dangerously overconfident. That's when the Americans decided to test a theory. Now you're probably thinking this involves some massive carrier strike group steaming into contested waters with all guns blazing. That's not what happened. In fact, the largest vessel involved in this entire operation was roughly the size of a commercial fishing trawler. The Pentagon calls it a USV, an unmanned surface vessel. But that dry acronym doesn't capture what these things actually are. Imagine a boat with no crew, packed with sensors, armed with weapons, and controlled by AI systems that can make split-second decisions faster than any human commander. The Chinese fleet detected the small American vessels approaching their perimeter. Standard procedure kicked in. Destroyers moved to intercept. Frigates formed a containment pattern, and surveillance aircraft scrambled to get overhead visuals. From Beijing's perspective, this was another routine intimidation exercise. Show overwhelming force, establish dominance, watch the intruders turn around. Except these boats didn't turn around. The lead USV continued forward directly toward the center of the Chinese formation. Warning signals went out. Radio channels crackled with demands to alter course. When that didn't work, fire control radars locked on. This is the point where most vessels would either retreat or escalate to active combat. These unmanned boats did neither. They just kept moving, maintaining course and speed like they had a dinner reservation they couldn't miss. That's when things got weird. 3 more USVs appeared from different vectors, then 7 more, then 15. They hadn't been hiding exactly. Chinese radar had detected them earlier but classified them as low-priority contacts, probably commercial traffic or fishing boats. But now all these scattered contacts were converging and their movement patterns were synchronized in ways that don't happen naturally. The Chinese fleet commander faced a decision. He had 67 warships under his command. The Americans had maybe 30 small unmanned boats. The math seemed absurdly lopsided, but something about the situation felt wrong. Why would the U.S. send such an obviously inferior force unless they knew something he didn't? He ordered weapons free. That's when the American boats vanished. Not literally. They were still there on radar, still visible to the naked eye. But every single Chinese weapon system that tried to lock onto them failed. Missiles couldn't acquire targets. Torpedoes went stupid the moment they entered the water. Even the old-fashioned deck guns that should have been able to hit anything they could see started missing by impossible margins. It was like trying to punch someone in a dream where your fists move through molasses. What the Chinese didn't know was that each of those small boats was broadcasting electronic warfare signals specifically designed to confuse and overwhelm their targeting systems. Not jamming in the traditional sense, which would have been obvious and easy to counter. This was something more subtle. The boats were feeding false data into Chinese sensors, making their own positions appear slightly different than they actually were. A few meters off here, a degree or two wrong there. Doesn't sound like much, right? In naval combat, a few meters is the difference between a direct hit and a complete miss. While the Chinese fleet was trying to figure out why none of their weapons were working properly, the American boats closed to attack range. And this is where the real surprise came in. Those USVs weren't just electronic warfare platforms. They were armed, not with the big missiles you'd find on a destroyer. Nothing that would show up as an obvious threat on initial scans. Instead, they carried dozens of small, cheap, expendable munitions. Think of them as the naval equivalent of drone swarms. Each boat launched its payload simultaneously. Hundreds of small projectiles, each one guided by its own targeting system, each one capable of independent decision-making. They didn't all go for the same target. The AI distributed them across the Chinese formation based on a priority algorithm that assessed which ships posed the biggest threat and which were most vulnerable. Destroyers with advanced air defense systems got swarmed by dozens of projectiles at once, overwhelming their ability to respond. Smaller frigates that tried to maneuver away found their escape routes already cut off by projectiles that had predicted their movements. The Chinese fleet's size, which should have been its greatest strength, became a liability. Ships were packed too close together for effective maneuvering. When one vessel tried to turn hard to evade, it risked colliding with friendlies. When they tried to coordinate defensive fire, their own electronic countermeasures interfered with each other. The Americans had turned their numerical advantage into a trap. 8 minutes after the first shot was fired, 31 Chinese vessels were either taking on water or broadcasting distress signals. Not all of them sank. Most were just damaged badly enough that they had to withdraw from the engagement. But the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The most powerful navy in Asia had just been humiliated by a handful of unmanned boats that cost less than a single destroyer. Here's what makes this really significant. This wasn't about the ships that got hit. Naval vessels get damaged in conflicts all the time, and all of these could be repaired or replaced. What matters is what this engagement proved about the future of naval warfare. For decades, the assumption has been that bigger fleets with bigger ships would always dominate smaller forces. Carriers, destroyers, submarines, all incredibly expensive, all requiring huge crews and extensive support infrastructure. But what if that entire model just became obsolete? What if you could achieve the same strategic effect with cheap, expendable, unmanned platforms that don't risk a single human life? The Pentagon just demonstrated that you can. And every navy in the world is now scrambling to figure out what that means for their own fleets. The Chinese certainly are, because they've got hundreds of billions of dollars invested in traditional warships that might have just been rendered as useful as battleships after the aircraft carrier was invented. And there's another problem they're facing that's even more concerning than the tactical defeat. They have no idea how many more of these unmanned boats the Americans have. Intelligence assessments vary wildly. Some analysts think the Americans might have a few dozen scattered across forward operating bases. Others believe they've already manufactured hundreds and are just waiting for the right moment to deploy them at scale. The uncertainty itself is a weapon. Every Chinese naval planner now has to account for the possibility that any engagement could suddenly involve swarms of these things appearing from nowhere. But let's zoom out from the tactical details for a second and look at what this really represents. We're witnessing the same revolution that transformed ground warfare when drones became dominant. Except now it's happening on water, and the implications are actually more profound at sea than they were on land. Think about it this way. On land, you've still got terrain, infrastructure, civilian populations that constrain how you can operate. But the ocean? 90% of it is essentially empty space where traditional rules don't apply. There's no cover, no civilians to worry about, no buildings to hide behind. It's the perfect environment for autonomous systems to operate with minimal restrictions. These unmanned boats can patrol for weeks at a time. They don't need rest, food, or psychological support. They don't suffer from fatigue or make emotional decisions under stress. And most importantly, losing one doesn't generate a single casualty report or grieving family back home. The political cost of deployment just dropped to nearly zero. Now consider how this changes the economics of naval power. A single American destroyer costs about $2 billion and requires a crew of 300. One of these unmanned boats, somewhere in the range of 2 to 5 million depending on the configuration. You could build 400 of them for the price of one destroyer, even if the Chinese managed to sink 90% of them in an engagement. You're still coming out ahead on the exchange rate. This is what military strategists call asymmetric warfare, but taken to an extreme that hasn't been possible before. Small nations with limited budgets could suddenly challenge traditional naval powers if they invest in this technology. You don't need a massive shipbuilding industry or decades of naval tradition anymore. You need good software engineers and a manufacturing facility that can produce small watercraft at scale. The Chinese understand this perfectly well, which is why their response has been so aggressive. Within 48 hours of the Sulu Sea engagement, they'd recalled their entire South China Sea fleet to ports and initiated what they're calling enhanced defensive protocols. That's diplomatic language for we have no idea how to counter this threat, and we need time to figure it out. Their military labs are now working around the clock on countermeasures. Some of what they're testing is pretty straightforward. Better electronic warfare capabilities, more advanced radar systems that can distinguish between small unmanned boats and regular maritime traffic. Kinetic defense weapons specifically designed to target drone swarms. The problem is that all of these solutions require time to develop and deploy, and they're expensive. Really expensive. Meanwhile, the Americans can iterate on their unmanned boat designs in months rather than years. Software updates get pushed remotely. New tactics get tested and implemented without requiring massive retraining programs. The development cycle speed alone gives them an advantage that's hard to overstate. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This technology doesn't just threaten Chinese naval power, it threatens the entire concept of power projection through carrier strike groups that the U.S. Navy itself has relied on for 80 years. Those 11 American aircraft carriers that cost $13 billion each and carry crews of 5,000, they're all potentially vulnerable to the exact same tactics that just worked in the Sulu Sea. What happens when every major naval power has access to these unmanned swarm systems? You get a situation where traditional surface fleets become almost impossible to operate in contested waters. The advantage shifts entirely to submarines and unmanned platforms, with everything else relegated to operations in permissive environments where there's no serious opposition. Some naval experts are calling this the end of the surface combatant era. That might be overstating it slightly, but the fundamental calculation has definitely changed. If you can't guarantee that your multi-billion-dollar warship won't get swarmed by cheap unmanned boats the moment it enters hostile waters, why are you building multi-billion-dollar warships? The Pentagon's already shifting budget allocations. Funding for the Next Generation Destroyer program just got cut by 30%. That money's being redirected toward unmanned systems development and AI research. 3 different defense contractors are now competing for a contract to build these boats at scale, with initial orders projected in the thousands. China's doing the same thing, obviously. They've got their own unmanned boat program that was apparently already in development before the Sulu Sea incident. The difference is that they're now playing catch-up on the AI side, which is the critical component that makes these systems actually work. You can build the boats easily enough. Getting them to coordinate autonomously in complex tactical situations? That requires machine learning capabilities that China's still trying to match. There's also a bigger question lurking beneath all of this that nobody wants to address directly. These boats in the Sulu Sea were operating under human oversight. There were American personnel monitoring the engagement and theoretically capable of overriding decisions if something went wrong. But the speed of modern naval combat is already pushing against the limits of human reaction time. At some point, probably sooner than anyone's comfortable admitting, these systems will need full autonomous authority to be effective, which means we're rapidly approaching a situation where AI systems will be making life and death decisions in combat without direct human control. Not because anyone particularly wants that, but because the operational reality demands it. The side that hesitates to give their unmanned systems full autonomy will lose the engagement before their human operators can even process what's happening. That's the real transformation here. It's not just about unmanned boats or drone swarms or electronic warfare. It's about the fundamental shift in how decisions get made in combat. We're moving toward a model where human commanders set broad objectives and rules of engagement. Then A, I handles everything that happens in the actual fight. The Sulu Sea engagement proved this model works. It also proved that traditional naval powers built around expensive crewed vessels are going to have a really hard time adapting. China just learned that lesson the expensive way. Every other navy is watching and trying to figure out how to avoid being next. The ocean just became a very different kind of battlefield, and the rule book everyone's been using for the past 70 years might as well be written in a dead language. The South China Sea isn't going back to what it was. Those 67 Chinese warships that limped back to port represent more than a tactical defeat. They're evidence that the entire foundation of naval power just shifted beneath everyone's feet. The question now isn't whether unmanned systems will dominate future conflicts. It's whether anyone can afford to keep building the kind of ships that just became obsolete. And nobody has a good answer yet.